Buen día a todos, bienvenidos al Webex del día de hoy. Hoy vamos a tener el tema titulado El lado oscuro de los usuarios poderosos, donde vamos a revisar algunas de las vulnerabilidades que están asociadas precisamente a estos usuarios poderosos dentro del IBMI. Quiero recordarles que a los asistentes a este Webex les vamos a hacer un diagnóstico sin costo. Y además les vamos a dar también la posibilidad de que prueben Authority Broker sin costo durante 30 días. La agenda del día de hoy es la siguiente. Vamos a hablar un poco de nosotros, después vamos a entrar precisamente al tema de este Webex y después vamos a tener una sección donde vamos a poder responder todas las dudas que ustedes tengan. Por favor, si durante el Webex tienen alguna duda, utilicen el área del chat para podernos hacer llegar la misma. Nosotros somos una empresa de consultoría que tenemos más de 20 años de experiencia en Latinoamérica y Europa. Hemos implementado diferentes soluciones que apoyan las mejores prácticas como son ITIL, ISO 27002 y COVID. El modelo de negocio que llevamos es el siguiente. En base a la experiencia y la tecnología existente, hemos desarrollado diferentes metodologías que nos permiten ofrecerles soluciones de software, actualización tecnológica y servicios de consultoría. Siempre nos basamos en las mejores prácticas y siempre cuidando los objetivos de su negocio. Las líneas de negocio que manejamos son las siguientes. Primero, el área de seguridad de la información. Aquí lo que nos interesa es que ustedes sepan qué está sucediendo con su información. Quién accede a ella, en qué momento se está modificando, si alguien quizás está intentando acceder a algún archivo que usted considere crítico, quizás se está haciendo una modificación o se pretende hacer una modificación fuera de horario, y usted puede determinar exactamente qué personas pueden modificar esta información, en qué horario se puede modificar, que reciba alertas en caso de que exista algún comportamiento anormal y que por supuesto siempre pueda tomar una acción que le permita que su información no esté en riesgo o que no pueda ser modificada por alguien que no esté autorizada. Incluso si esta modificación se realizara y no está autorizada, usted tiene la opción de elegir que se pueda revertir de manera automática y recibir un informe exactamente de lo que se estuvo haciendo. También, si necesitan utilizar encriptación a través de diferentes medios, nosotros podemos ayudarle, ya sea a través de correo electrónico, a través de las carpetas compartidas que normalmente utilizamos, a través de una nube privada o incluso realizando el FTP o FTP seguro. En el área de monitoreo de servicios de TI, nos interesa que usted pueda saber todo lo que está ocurriendo con sus servicios de TI y la infraestructura asociada con este. De manera que si algo está afectando a su servicio, usted reciba alertas en tiempo real sobre lo que está sucediendo. Quizás algo está afectando a su facturación o algo puede estar mal en la parte del inventario o quizás algo está creando algún problema en simplemente lo que es todo el proceso de ventas. Usted va a recibir alertas sobre lo que se está ocasionando y obviamente para que pueda recibir alguna información en tiempo real que le permita tomar una decisión. Incluso si se detectara que es algún cuello de botella o alguna latencia en la red lo que está ocasionando este problema, podemos ayudarle a que exactamente sepa qué equipos están ocasionando esta latencia o este cuello de botella y que pueda tomar alguna acción que permita solucionar el funcionamiento de su servicio de TI. En el área de control de cambios podemos ayudarles a que controlen todo el ciclo de desarrollo de software, desde el momento en el que el usuario está haciendo la solicitud, obviamente pasando por lo que son toda la asignación de estas solicitudes a los programadores, el desarrollo que ellos hacen y por supuesto todas las pruebas que tengan que hacer en los diferentes ambientes que se hayan definido y pasando por lo que es la implementación en todas las plataformas con las que se cuenten. En el área de Performance and Capacity Planning podemos ayudarlos a que sepan ustedes exactamente cómo se están comportando sus servidores en el día a día. Ustedes van a saber exactamente qué está ocurriendo con su CPU, con su memoria, qué ocurre cuando están corriendo quizás algún proceso en alguna de las áreas o exactamente cómo se están ocupando todos los recursos de su servidor. Con esta misma información podemos hacer una proyección. En el caso de que tengan un aumento en las operaciones, usted va a saber si el servidor actual le puede soportar ese aumento en las operaciones. De esa manera puede saber si quizás necesita más memoria o el CPU no lo va a soportar, y si es necesario algún cambio le podemos sugerir este cambio, ya sea en alguno de los componentes o directamente en todo el servidor. En el área de automatización de tareas y procesos de TI, nos interesa que cualquier flujo que usted pueda tener se pueda automatizar, independiente de la plataforma en la que se encuentre. Quizás tiene algún proceso que inicie en algún equipo Windows, después pueda continuar con algún servidor Linux y que incluso pueda terminar en algún equipo iSeries. Podemos realizar toda esta automatización de los diferentes procesos y obviamente nuestra idea es que usted pueda automatizar los tiempos de su área y que pueda sacar mayor provecho a todo esto sin tener que estar una persona atrás de este proceso y dependiendo obviamente de la disponibilidad de esa persona. Si usted tiene un proceso de cierre diario, si tiene una alimentación de inventarios a través de una hoja de Excel, si quizás recibe un correo y ese correo dispara una actualización en una base de datos, o ese mismo correo podría estarle diciendo que necesita dar de alta a unos usuarios. Todos estos procedimientos se pueden automatizar independientemente de la plataforma y obviamente nosotros podemos ayudarles con esta automatización. Durante estos 20 años hemos trabajado con diferentes clientes y aquí algunos de ellos. Además contamos con alianzas con empresas líderes, lo cual nos permite ofrecerles nuestro software de vanguardia y los servicios especializados. Para el Webex del día de hoy contamos con la presencia de Robin Tatum, quien trabaja para Health System y es Director of Security Technologies. Hello Robin, please proceed with the Webex.
We're going to be talking, of course, today about privileged users. I'm just going to kind of fast forward through the first couple of slides here. That's my contact information. My name is Robin Tatum. I am the Director of Security Technologies here at Health Systems, and that role allows me to have the privilege of traveling the world and speaking to groups and organizations about the challenges and steps necessary to secure the Power Systems platform. When we talk about the source of the common data breach, we see that insiders are included in several of the top causes here. Interestingly, the first one being negligent insiders. Now, when we talk to organizations about the threat of insiders, I think there is a misperception that that means that they're always out to cause harm. And the reality is most of the calls that we take in regards to challenges caused by insiders, it really is a genuine mistake. Somebody has copied the wrong file or run the wrong program or dragged and dropped a folder within the IFS. And it was purely an accidental error. We want to make sure that security, of course, supports the idea that users should only be able to perform the tasks that are part of their business requirements. We don't want to make it easy, in essence, for people to accidentally do the wrong thing. Of course, there's always that element of maliciousness or criminal insiders that are trying to take advantage, perhaps, of a situation, access to data that they've been given. And that comprises another large chunk of the threats that we see. Now, this study was published by Ponemon Institute. They're very well known for their analytics of not only the cause of a data breach and the threats of data breaches, but also the cost of that type of data breach. So if you've ever heard reference to the amount of money that it costs per record when a data breach occurs, these are the guys that have published that information. So which organizations typically experience internal or employee-based fraud? Well, there's four primary industries that encounter this type of thing. Banking and financial services, of course, are the one at the top. And I think that probably comes as no big surprise for people based on the fact, of course, that everybody's trying to monetize or profit from these types of breaches in some way, shape, or form. And of course, the expectation is that banking and financial services have lots of money being banded around its sides. So just like in, I think, the traditional robbery mindset, we see that as being a very profitable target. We also see a large amount of government and public sector organizations being attacked, administrative functions, as well as manufacturing. The interesting thing about manufacturing is I think a lot of people don't expect that there's any information there that really could be profited from. But the reality is a lot of times manufacturing industries are quite easy to attack because a lot of times the technology being used, such as handheld devices and other types of shop floor applications, often are configured in such a way that people that are perhaps looking to get onto the system as quickly as possible and remain as efficient often are sharing user IDs. Those IDs are being displayed on very small, perhaps handheld type devices, and so passwords are kept short. And so we do see a pattern there with manufacturing and distribution that does leave them a little bit more prone to that type of exposure. When we look at the cost of a data breach, we see that the median loss is approaching $150,000 US, and more than 20% of those are exceeding $1 billion. And when we talk to organizations about their security budget, and obviously just like any kind of budget, money is usually tightly controlled, it really does pale in comparison when we look at the idea that the implications of somebody being breached, especially when it comes from an insider, that can certainly exceed that budget requirement quite significantly. Interestingly, almost a half of the victims out there did not recover any of the taking, meaning that it was a permanent loss. If it was data, there's really no way to call that back in. It's out in the wild. It's out in the wild. So who are the employees that are committing this type of fraud? Well, the vast majority of the fraud actions in this particular study were committed by those individuals that happen to work in one of these 6 departments: accounting, operations, sales, executive management, customer device management, and purchasing. Interestingly, most of the perpetrators of these types of crimes have no past record of having done so. We found that 87% had never been charged with any type of fraud offense, and 84% had never been punished or terminated by a prior employee for any type of fraud-related activities. Now, what we usually look for is certain red flags. Certainly the biggest is the idea that someone is living beyond their means. That's usually the most obvious one that we can detect. Somebody perhaps has a certain amount of salary, but they're driving a more expensive car or live in a bigger property than perhaps their normal salary would normally suggest would be within those boundaries. We also note that 27% have financial difficulties of some kind. I think that is quite a motivator for people. We saw that quite explicitly during the last round of this financial crisis that I think pretty much every country has been through. We also see potentially that drug addiction or gambling addiction or any type of kind of anomaly like that can lead someone to be desperate for financial support, and they may then turn to easy opportunity whereby they can profit from something that they see floating in front of them. 19% had a pretty close relationship with their vendors or customers, perhaps skewing their perception of whether they're trying to do favors for people or perhaps profit from that particular close relationship. Interestingly, 18% had excessive control issues. So if you know anybody who is a control freak, they could be one of the 18%. One of the big challenges of insider breaches and threat is the fact that it really does extend out the challenge of discovering this kind of information. Most insiders have obtained quite easily and legitimately credentials to the network and the server that is being breached, meaning that they have accomplished what would arguably be the biggest challenge that is presented to most actual outside hackers, which is access. Now, when we see that these users are able to legitimately access a server, they may be exploiting their privileges to be able to use them in ways that were not originally anticipated. It can take upwards of 18 months for an inside breach to be detected and remediated, which is up from about 6 months for an outside sourced breach. If you're interested in learning about the types of breaches that are happening, there is a chronology of breaches maintained by an organization called Privacy Rights. This website tracks breaches that entail private or proprietary information. You can filter this, which I did about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, on just those breaches that entail insider-type anomalies. And I determined that as of the time of that check, that there had been over 36 million records breached by somebody inside the organization. That was being sourced from over 500 different data breaches. Very interesting website. If you haven't been out there, I certainly recommend that you take a look. Just head out to privacyrights.org. And there's a lot of regulatory reaction to the idea of inside breaches, but we certainly have a number of laws out there that have been instigated largely because there has been some type of insider threat or trading disagreement. Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, came out of some of the mishandling by companies like Enron a number of years ago, where the accounting information was being manipulated in ways that certainly were not ethical and very illegal. Now, the laws have been established in a desperate attempt to prevent those types of breaches or mismanagement happening again. In the case of SOX, we see that there is a requirement for annual assessments of the effectiveness of those internal controls, especially in the case of financial reporting. Again, we have to then get attestation from external auditors that these checks are being made and that they are in fact effective. Now that means that the auditors are the interpreters of these laws. When we look to Sarbanes-Oxley or HIPAA, we don't see any specifics in there about setting your system values a certain way or how many privileges a user should have. So the auditor is the one that has to read through that and kind of apply some reasonableness to the idea that a particular configuration does meet these legislative requirements. There's also industry regulations as well, not technically laws on the books, but certainly they can apply a lot of pressure to their member organizations. Probably one of the best known is the payment card industry. Handling all the credit card processing, these guys have 12 requirements that are the premise behind securing all of the credit card data. Requirements 6 and 7 speak to the requirements to secure the system, but just like those laws like Sarbanes-Oxley, we find that they're open to interpretation. For example, requirement 6 simply says that you have to develop and maintain secure systems and applications. Requirement 7 says you've got to restrict access to that important data information on a business need-to-know basis. Again, the auditors are the interpreters. In this case, the auditors are referred to as QSA folks. They're specially certified by the PCI Standards Council in order to perform payment card industry audits. But again, they're interpreting those requirements down to determine if they're being adhered to. The auditors simply interpret those regulations, and they're using particular frameworks to do that. Again, they don't necessarily have specific directives within their regulations and legislation, so they use a framework, often known as COVID or ISO or ITIL. There are 3 examples of some of the frameworks that are out there. But at the end of the day, auditors often conclude that the IT department is typically lacking when it comes to internal controls. Now, I'm not pointing fingers at IT because obviously sponsorship is a major requirement here. IT can only do so much, and it's important that the executive team sponsor the idea that a system environment needs to be secure, and IT is there simply to implement it. Control and monitoring of privileged users, of course, heads up the list of these challenges. Of course, a server is not going to try and hack another. It's all about people, be it people from outside or people from inside. We need to be able to control the actions of human beings when they're accessing this information to make sure that it is available for those where they need to know, but that we resist access from those that do not. What we find is executives tend to follow auditor recommendations much more than they do of the IT staff. If you're in IT, you may know that frustration, but I think we're starting to break down some of those walls as executives determine that there is issues here, and ultimately they could be held responsible. The COVID framework that I mentioned does speak to the idea that there needs to be powerful users on the system, and we in IT know that there is a requirement often for us that need to fix things. the idea that management should establish parameters that work through the idea that there may need to be emergency changes or procedures to oversee or control that type of break glass operation. COVID also speaks to the requirement to have authorizations for temporary access or emergency access. These need to be documented on standard forms. They need to be maintained and approved by managers in securely communicating the function that the user performs, in addition to terminating those privileges after some type of predetermined period. So the idea here is that we do acknowledge that there is times when the user needs to be on the system, but there needs to be oversight of their actions. It needs to go through process, and those privileges need to be removed once the action is completed. ISO has something similar. It speaks to privilege management, whereby the allocation of additional privileges should be controlled through, again, a formal authorization process. That means that we're not simply just giving people permissions that they have on their profile all the time. The privileges need to be allocated to an individual on a need-to-use basis each and every time that requirement comes up, not given once and then maintained going forward. That authorization process needs to record the privileges that are being given as well as what they're being used for. And the privileges should be assigned to a different user identity than those used for normal business, which is interesting because we actually prefer them to be given to the straight user ID that the user is using. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that and that's one of the approaches we use in order to accomplish that. Now, the premise behind the ISO requirements here is simply that we don't want people sharing a common privileged account. The idea then is that if that were to happen, we wouldn't have any accountability if the individual was that actually used that amount of privilege. So we want to have a different user identity than those used on a normal day-to-day basis, but there are ways in the power systems world that we can actually get around that in a more comprehensive way than the intent of the ISO requirement. Now, I've mentioned power system servers, but let's talk about how all of this applies to us in the IBMI space. First of all, we have to stop for a second and define what is a powerful user in the IBMI world. There's really no de facto definition of this, so I'm going to offer up mine. To me, a powerful user is someone that is carrying one or more of the 8 special authorities that are available on their profile. They're basically administrative privileges. We just call them special authorities. It could also be somebody who has private authority to primarily the application object. If you have a user that has named permission to every file in the database, they're going to be a powerful user. We can also look to any user that is operating on a server that has very permissive public authority. Now, if you've heard the term public, but are not completely familiar with that definition, it really refers to any user that doesn't have a private or named authority. Think of it as a default permission, a catch-all, if you will, of the amount of authority that a user may have. Now, I've got that hint there that this is most of them. One of the pieces of insight that I get from the State of IBMI security study is that most servers are shipped and are maintained in an allow-all configuration. So, in essence, this could mean that all users on a server could be deemed powerful. Now, I usually take 1 or 2 or 3 of those criteria, and anybody who meets any of those in conjunction with the ability to run commands would be my base definition of a powerful user. Now, it's not completely black and white. There are certainly gray areas here, but the ability to execute a command in some environment is certainly going to allow the user then to leverage the permissions or the privileges that they have been given. Notice I did not say here that a user that has unlimited capabilities. If you're familiar with the limit capability parameter on a user's profile, bear in mind, while that does have good effect of containing user command functions in a green screen environment, there are other ways to run commands that do not respect the limit capability setting. So I phrased it deliberately as a user with a way to execute commands. So I mentioned special authorities or administrative privileges, and as I said before, there's 8 of these. And just as a quick recap of what each of them is, first of all, we have all objects. This is the most powerful privilege on the system. This is the gold or skeleton key to every single object on the server, including those supplied as part of the operating system. In many instances, it also allows you to perform various administrative operations, including the ability to access every single file, meaning every data element on the server within your application. One of the privileges that AllObject provides is, of course, that ability to access all objects, one of which is user profiles. So as an AllObject user, if I do have the ability to run commands, it's not overly challenging for me to be able to run a job of somebody else because I have permission to their profile. And if that other user has, say, the other 7 special authorities, the AllObject user now has gained all 8 privileges. The security administrator is responsible for creating and managing the profiles on the system. It allows us to be able to make these profiles without necessarily being part of a security officer class, which is a default that allows the user to have all 8 special authorities. It also means we don't typically have to give all objects authority, but one thing people notice quickly is when you pull up a list of profiles as a security administrator, you may not see a very comprehensive list. Now, why is that? Well, it may be that you don't have the authority to the profiles that already exist on the system, usually obtained by being the person that created them in the first place. For that reason, a lot of people assign SecAdmin in conjunction with AllObject so that when they see the list, it is all profiles. But what's happening then by assigning that AllObject is that, of course, we're opening the floodgates to all access to the database as well as the user's profiles. I/O system configuration, input-output system configuration, is primarily for managing communications in and out of the box. Now, back in the early days, that was lines, controllers, and devices, so if you know what those are, you've probably been around a little while. If you're not familiar, then you're probably part of the newer generation, and you are going to be more familiar with the TCP/IP services. Starting and stopping things like FTP and DDM are all functions of I/O system config. You can also configure TCP itself, which, if done incorrectly, is of course going to leave the server unable to communicate with users. Audit privileges allow a user to turn on and off some of the built-in audit functions in the operating system. Now we see about 10 to 12% of servers each year that don't have the auditing function turned on, which is really quite sad because this functionality is quite good and it's included in the operating system. And if you have any type of regulatory compliance, I can guarantee that it will speak to the idea that important events need to be logged, and this is the mechanism to do it. An audit user may be separate from a security administrator if there is some type of regulatory mandate telling us that we have to support a separation of duties. Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, is very big on the idea of the left hand overseeing the actions of the right hand. So we segregate the audit functionality from somebody who is an administrator like a SecAdmin. Of course, we want to make sure that we're overseeing the actions of a security administrator as much, if not more so, than our traditional users because they are highly skilled and typically they have the most access, and that's a powerful combination. Spool control is the AllObject of spool files. Now, if you're not familiar with a spool file, basically printed output that has not yet come out of the printer. So it could contain all of the same data that is in those secure files. We may see payroll information. We may see account information or customer lists. It could all be potentially sitting out there in a spooled environment. With spool control, I can access any output queue and see any spool file within those queues, regardless of any restrictions that may have been imposed. Service privileges are not quite as powerful as they used to be, based on the idea that the primary function of service privileges is to allow a user access to an area of the system called System Service Tools, or SST. This is kind of the power systems equivalent of a PC's BIOS, meaning that we get into some low-level hardware-type functionality, allowing us to do things like communication traces or initializing the disk unit. Starting in version 5, IBM said, programmatically, you can go into SST and do things and then terminate the program, which was potentially a significant security risk. So they established the requirement to have a login to SST. So having service gets you as far as the login, but it doesn't actually get you inside. Assuming that you've changed the well-known, well-documented default profiles and passwords, then you are probably fairly safe by giving someone service, even if they don't need to get into SST. But of course, like anything else, why give a privilege that's not needed? Job control is one of the most frequently assigned privileges, but also one of the most powerful. Job control is an administrative privilege, not the authority simply to submit a job to batch. You don't need a special authority to do that. Job control allows a user to manage the jobs that are running on the system, as well as moving jobs from queue to queue. This is something that would be consummate to perhaps a user who is a operator or some type of administrator. There is also some interaction between job control and the output queue. So if you have spool files and the queue is marked as under operator control, while the spool file may not be visible to a job control user, they may be able to delete the spool file or move it to a different output queue or put it on hold. One thing we watch with job control is that this is the primary control that indicates to the system whether the user is allowed to bring the system down into a restricted state, because that is the power system's equivalent of safe mode in Windows. Not something you probably want an edge user being able to do during the middle of the day. We also have save sys authority, which is a permission to create an immediate save of every object on the system. So if you're a night operator and you're responsible for doing an entire system save, this is a really handy authority. It alleviates the requirements that would exist otherwise, that perhaps that same user would have all object authority to save those things. Remembering that all object not only lets them save the object, but would also let them see it, change it, and even delete it as well. Not good. The other option would be to give private authority to every single object on the system so that the user has that permission on an object-by-object basis. The problem with that, of course, is that it's a maintenance nightmare and probably not something that you're going to want to maintain. So save sys is a beneficial authority, just like all of these are, but we tend to give it to people that are not fulfilling the role of a system operator. If you are securing your environment only at a library level, if at all, be aware that having save sys authority will allow you, the user, to take a duplicate, in other words, save an object out of a restricted library and perhaps restore it to a non-restricted library, either on the same system or another server. They may then be able to view or download the contents of the duplicate. In essence, even though it's only a few seconds old, they're still getting that private data and being able to access it. It's also potentially possible to change or delete that data in the original file by maybe changing it in the duplicate, backing it up, and storing it over the top of the original. Or in the case of the delete, running a save command specifying storage start free is one of the parameter options, which is an archiving function that exists in IBMI that will flush the data out to free up the storage taken by the object. So who are these powerful users? Well, we have programmers that claim they need all object authority to fix production applications. We have admins that say they need the authority to configure and change system value. We have operators that need job control and save sys in order to do backups and manage workload on the system. And of course, we have vendors who typically claim that they have to be security officers in order to, quote-unquote, maintain their own application. Now, IT personnel often insist the powerful authorities are a base requirement. We see a lot of them being assigned to that class of user. Sometimes they're right, though. They do need this permission. I've certainly been in IT many years, and there's numerous times where I needed some type of special authority in order to remediate a problem that the server was having. What we see, however, according to the state of security, is that we have a tremendous over-assignment of these privileges. Now, these are averages that we saw on the study in 2016. So, on average, we have almost 150 all-object profiles on each system. Now, bear in mind, they're root class users. They have access to everything, including the operating system. And I sincerely doubt that we have almost 150 people in that type of role. Even when we subtract down some of the IBM profiles or even service accounts, I can guarantee that, there's still going to be over 100 on average, and that is far in excess of any proven requirement. When we look at spool control and job control, we see an average of almost 450 users running with these types of privileges. In the case of job control, imagine almost 450 users on your server being able to bring the system down into a restricted state. Now, if you think that that's probably not the state of most systems out there, think again. I do probably close to 200 different risk assessments on an annual basis. So I just grabbed 4 of the ones that I've done over the last couple of weeks so that you can see in this case here, the prime example, we've got a server that had almost 150 users running with each of the 8 special authorities. We had a system down here with 600 all-object users. This one had over 200 all-object users as well as more than 200 users that could bring the system into a restricted state. So these are just samples of ones that I've done very recently, and this is a pattern that I see day in, day out all year long. Now these are some examples of postings that were placed on iSeriesNetwork.com. This first one is certainly, I think, one that we can look at and think, well, that would never happen to me, and let's hope not, right? This gentleman has deleted a library accidentally and realized he has no recent tape backup. Asked all the users to sign off, looking for help, happy to upgrade his subscription, which I always find kind of ironic. It's very similar to the security message. We have people that really don't want to allocate budget to resolving security challenges or hardening their security configuration, right up until the point that they experience some type of data breach. At which point the budget is wide open, the CTO, the CFO is telling them to purchase any and all tools that they can. But the reality is it's much better to harden the environment before the problem because it's going to be disruptive regardless. Now this is a delete command that we ran on one of our test systems here, delete program QCMD. I don't know if you've ever tried using QCMD, but I am strongly recommending that you don't run this command like we did. We did it just to test it out because we wanted to show that it could be done. As an all-object user, you have every right to delete any and all objects on the system, this one included. Now, if you're not familiar with QCMD, you have to understand that this is the program that processes all commands. So once I delete this, I have no ability to actually do any command-type functions on the system. All your CL programs will fail, all your command-line actions will fail. I think most of us, our first reaction would be, oh, we need to restore that back from our backup, but you can't run a restore object, you can't run a restore live because those are commands. Now, nobody would ever do this in real life other than the test system we have, would they? Well, in this case, somebody did. They deleted QCMD based on a spelling error against the delete program command, and they noted that the system had crashed. Now, they're looking for suggestions, assuming that an IPL is going to be a base requirement, but is there anything else that somebody can suggest? I love that last statement that this is bad. Absolutely, this server was down, and it was not coming back without actually bringing it up from distribution media. So the server had to be taken down, which is not easy to do when you can't run the shutdown command, so it will be a front panel shutdown. And then they would have to reboot from some form of distribution media or full system save media in order to do what's called a demode IPL, which is to bring it back up to reinstall the operating system. Even if they had those tapes handy sitting there, this is a multi-hour operation, if not longer, extremely disruptive simply because somebody typed one destructive command. So the problem inherently is that in order to keep the business functioning, we have to acknowledge that there will be times where we need emergency access. We've got to repair corrupted files or perform tasks that are going to be kind of managed by the administrative team. But in order to do that safely, we've got to know when those privileged authorities are being used. Ideally, we're going to include monitoring of what I call black hole commands, or commands that take you into an invisible tunnel. Some examples of those may include interactive SQL, where we can potentially log that the user issued the start SQL command, but we have no log of the commands that they ran inside that environment. Things like update, blanket select statements, or delete statements are things that really should have some visibility to. Other utilities and tools like DFU, system service tools we mentioned, QShell, all of these environments allow the user to do extremely powerful things on the server. There's no logging or very limited logging of those types of environments, which is really a problem as those are the most powerful environments on the system. We need to have oversight of the commands that are being issued by powerful users and the functions they're performing. So I'd like to introduce a solution within our portfolio. It's one of our most popular tools. It's called Authority Worker, and this is designed to expressly to resolve that challenge of assigning privileges on a temporary, as-needed basis and providing oversight of that user's action. Now, the premise here is kind of like Clark Kent going into the traditional phone booth and coming out as Superman. You're on the system as perhaps a base level user. Even if you're a programmer, you may have privileges or just a base profile on, say, a production system. But when you need to perform what would be deemed a restricted task, you have the ability to elevate your privileges right on the fly. No longer do you have to have a secondary ID or a shared privileged account like USecOffice. You don't have to have a backup profile as well. You can simply elevate your privileges. Now, of course, we do that with oversight. It's not a free-for-all. You have to be authorized to use that function, and we can make it that somebody has to approve the request before the additional privileges are given. But once that happens, the user is given the special authorities or the private authorities on a target profile, and that user can then perform whatever task it is they need to perform. At the end of a particular time, or when they decide to voluntarily relinquish those permissions, the user simply returns back to their base profile. And the good part about this, in my opinion, is not only the elevation of privileges, but the ability that we have to audit that user's action. We have not only command auditing being issued, but we also have a screen cam that will track the user's movement throughout the green screen 5250 environment. If they go into interactive SQL, we can observe their statement. If they go into SSP or even do a pass-through to another system, we can follow that session throughout the environment. That screen cam can be viewed in near real time, so if you're sitting at another display and you want to know what that vendor is doing when they connect to your system, it's a very easy process to look over their shoulder in a virtual sense. We also have the ability, of course, to bundle all of those screenshots together into a PDF and email it out to the recipient or the interested party. The programmer perhaps elevates their privileges based on a call ticket. Upon completion of their actions, all of the screenshots are bundled into that PDF, distributed automatically where they can be reviewed and filed away for audit purposes. The nice thing about the PDFs is that they're searchable, indexed. So we have the ability to actually scan through that PDF looking for a start SSP or a start SQL command, looking to see if it exists within the PDF. Having those screenshots in kind of a text form within there also means that the PDF maintains a minimal size as well. Management now becomes aware of all activity. We have the ability to log and report on it. From an audit perspective, this is good news to the auditor. In fact, especially Sarbanes-Oxley auditors absolutely love this feature. It exists in a basic form in other operating systems. So if you've ever heard of sudo or su type functions in AIX and Linux, then this is kind of the power systems equivalent. But we've taken it a step further with the additional audit visibility in addition to the elevation of privileges. So why do we need a tool like this? Well, it allows us to monitor and control the usage of these powerful authorities, letting you specify the when and the how of your users gaining additional authority above and beyond what they would normally carry. It works using some existing IBMI functions. So this is not creating a brand new process. It's front-ending some IBMI sanctioned functionality. In fact, the operating system does this type of thing. We're just putting a front end so you can use it as well. It gives us notification and monitoring as well as control of those privileged users and includes visibility in, like I said, to those non-command-based environments. Another component that is popular in our portfolio for managing privileged users is called command security. And this is a really unique tool. I absolutely love this tool because it's something that I was looking for many years back in the AS400 and I-Series days, whereby once a user is privileged on the system, regardless of whether you just simply gave those privileges out or whether they elevate and have those privileges, ultimately they become privileged on the system. So does the operating system do anything to apply a sense of reasonableness to that user's action? Let's take, for example, a user who is a system operator or admin. They have the authority of job control, which allows them to power the server down. Perhaps that's an appropriate task because every Sunday that person is in doing an entire system save and they decide to do an IPL at the end of it or apply some PTS or something along that line. The problem is that that user now has that permission and the operating system says you can do it however and whenever you want, meaning the user could accidentally power the server down 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, even though that is not an authorized window for a reboot of the server. Now, I'm just using that as an example, but think about all the commands on the system and whether there is any additional oversight once a user is authorized. In my environment, I have security officers that perform demos on the system, but we have auditing turned on the machine. As a security officer, I have permission to actually turn that auditing off, which again is going to be a regulatory issue, but it's also a common sense issue that I don't want anybody turning off the audit function in the operating system. So I have a rule set up that says if anybody attempts to manipulate the QOP control system value, regardless of whether they have permission to do so in the eyes of the operating system, I actually reject that request and send a notification out through email. Now, the premise behind command security is that it intercepts a command before the operating system runs it, allowing us to take a look. Who's running it? When are they running it? How are they running it? We can look at the parameters on the command to determine if there is a parameter being specified that could cause an issue. Now, with the conditional type of evaluation, we could then perform an action, including running the command as another user, or running a different command, or changing the parameters, or, of course, everybody's favorite, stopping the command from executing, simply blocking it. Very powerful, giving us, finally, some control over a security officer or all-object user. So even if you have a requirement by your application provider, which does happen occasionally, that a user has to have a privilege like all-object, it no longer has to be a global permission to everything. You can limit that function so that they can have some level of restrictions or oversight. So why do we use command security? Well, that ability to conditionally intercept a command and perform an action. Again, allowing us to specify when and how users are running commands on the system, including those users that have privileges like all object, which are so prevalent today. Command security gives us that notification, monitoring, and control of the privileged environment, and can even enforce the requirement to get privileges through a tool like Authority Broker. Let's take, for example, the ability to enter interactive SQL. That's actually a public use command, meaning anybody with command line access can issue a start SQL. Once they get into SQL, the access to the database is what controls it. But maybe I only want that user to go into interactive SQL if they've changed their privileges so that the screen cam is activated. Using command security, I can check and see if the user has used Authority Broker to basically activate that process. And if they are, I allow them the SQL to run. If not, then I prevent the command and I indicate to the user that they have to run start SQL through a Authority Broker switch. In summary here, from an IT perspective, we finally are gaining executive attention. So we have a great opportunity now to start remediating some of the problems that we've dealt with for many, many years in the IBMI community. It's important that we gain that management approval now. I think, in the news just the last couple of days, we've seen information about a massive data breach at Yahoo. Unfortunate as that is, it's not unique. We're seeing this stuff all the time, and what we see is that there is a significant portion of those that have an underlying element of some type of insider threat. So having a user required to elevate their privileges rather than have a baseline profile that has the keys to the kingdom is very important. Even with an outside breach, ultimately they're going to access a profile on the system. And as a way to prevent accident, right? It's not all malicious. Certainly there's a tremendous amount of accidental activity that causes these issues. But we don't have to simply accept that even IT users have to be limitless. There still needs to be oversight and control. For the IBMI folks among us, we have this perfect storm. We, of course, have some of the most valuable data in the organization stored on this server platform, which is a great thing. But we also see that security awareness amongst most IBMI professionals is generally pretty low. It's not an area that we're heavily trained in. We also, unfortunately, have a lack of awareness of IBMI amongst audit professionals, meaning that even when we are in a regulatory environment, we don't get somebody interrogating the system configuration and pointing out weaknesses. Now, if you're the person who has to respond to the audit, you may think that's a good thing. And over the years, certainly I know people that have been happy that they can certainly pull the wool over the eyes of an auditor, gives them, certainly less work to do. But at the end of the day, it's doing ourselves a disservice. We're not finding the vulnerabilities. We're not being forced to remediate them. Yet that's an important step. I can tell you for an absolute statement of fact that most IBMI data is not secured. The server is configured in an allow all state, and most organizations, based on the thousands of assessments that we've done, have not changed that. We also see that users are far too powerful. Even when the database is secure, we suddenly find that users have been granted all permission to the database, and or the user has all objects and has the keys to the kingdom. Most of this data is accessed easily through PC interfaces like FTP, and most of the time there's no logging of that type of action. In fact, 2/3 of the systems we looked at last year had no oversight of any PC connections like FTP or ODBC. Let's give you a few seconds to answer that. If you do have any questions, like I said, feel free to pop the chat window open and post them there. I'll hang out just for a minute.
Thank you, Robin, for your help. Muchas gracias por el tiempo que hemos estado en este Webex. Estamos recibiendo sus preguntas a través del chat. Lamentablemente el tiempo no nos va a alcanzar para responderlas. Vamos a utilizar el correo para responderlas durante el transcurso del día. Solamente les queremos recordar dos cosas. La primera es que estamos ofreciendo un diagnóstico de seguridad sin costo y también pueden aprovechar y probar Authority Broker sin costo durante 30 días. Lamentablemente por el momento se nos acaba el tiempo del Webex. Mi nombre es Pablo López y nos estamos escuchando en otro Webex posterior. Buen día.